The Wyoming winter of 2019 had turned brutal in ways that only the high plains could deliver. Snow fell in waves that erased the horizon. Wind gusts exceeded 60 miles per hour, and temperatures plummeted to levels where exposed skin froze in minutes. On a remote ranch 47 miles from the nearest town, a pickup truck sputtered to a stop on a rural highway, its engine finally succumbing to the cold after running on fumes for the last 5 miles. A woman stumbled out into the whiteout, her coat inadequate for the conditions, her breathing already labored from the altitude and the panic consuming her thoughts. Behind her, a small voice called out through the howling wind, "Mommy, it's so cold." The 8-year-old girl, wrapped in a blanket her mother had pulled around her shoulders before abandoning their vehicle, could barely see 3 feet in front of her face, but her mother could see something through the storm. A light, distant and flickering, but unmistakably artificial against the white chaos surrounding them. A structure, shelter, hope. The mother grabbed her daughter's hand and began walking, each step deliberate and determined despite knowing that every moment they spent exposed to these conditions brought them closer to hypothermia and death. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. The wind threatened to knock them sideways. The cold penetrated every layer of clothing. The girl's breathing became more labored, her mother's grip on her hand tightening with desperation. Then a shape emerged from the storm. A massive barn structure, its outline barely visible against the swirling snow. Beyond it, the light they'd been following resolved into a window of a ranch house. The mother didn't hesitate. She carried her daughter toward that window, toward that light, toward whatever waited inside. Her hand rose and she pounded on the wooden door with the last of her strength. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound barely audible over the shrieking wind, then silence. Nothing. Had anyone heard? Were they about to collapse on a porch, only feet away from salvation that might refuse them entry? The mother's hand rose for another attempt. But the door swung inward first. A man stood in the doorway, enormous, at least 6'5", broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that belonged to someone who'd spent decades working beneath the unforgiving sun. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he took in the 2 figures standing on his porch, soaked and trembling. "Mommy!" the girl gasped between labored breaths. "Mommy, I can't breathe good." It was the kind of statement that would later spark an entire sequence of events, that would challenge everything the community believed about strangers, about help, about the obligations we owe to people in crisis. But in that moment, it was simply a child's terrified observation of her own failing body. The rancher didn't think. He didn't question. He simply reacted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Reed had purchased the Clearwater Ranch in Wyoming 17 years earlier with a specific intention that had nothing to do with becoming a successful cattle operator. He wanted solitude. He wanted space. He wanted distance from people, from complicated relationships, from the fundamental messiness of human connection. The property sprawled across 1,200 acres of high plains terrain, situated in a valley that made it nearly inaccessible during winter storms. The nearest neighbor lived 14 miles away. The nearest town, Millbrook, population 3,200, required a 40-minute drive under good conditions and could become unreachable for weeks during severe weather. For someone determined to be left alone, it was perfect. Marcus had not always been solitary by nature. In his youth, in Denver, where he'd grown up, he'd been social enough. He'd attended high school, where he'd been remembered as the quiet kid, who was nonetheless known for his unexpected kindness. He'd gone to college, studying agricultural science, with the vague intention of eventually owning land. He'd even maintained friendships, attended social gatherings, tried the dating scene without much success or enthusiasm. But at age 26, his life had taken a sharp turn that fundamentally altered his relationship with other people. He'd been working for a large cattle operation east of Denver, a sprawling enterprise owned by a man named Robert Caldwell. The work was demanding but satisfying. Marcus had proven himself competent, reliable, and dedicated to the animals and the land with an intensity that impressed Caldwell enough to make him a supervisor within 3 years. Then Caldwell's daughter, Eleanor, had returned home from her college years back east with a degree in business and plans to modernize her father's operations. She was intelligent, ambitious, and possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people toward her. Marcus, despite his reserved nature, had found himself increasingly in her presence as they worked together on implementing new management systems for the ranch. It had taken him months to recognize that Eleanor's attention to him went beyond professional interest. By the time he fully understood that she was pursuing a relationship, he was already emotionally invested in a way that made objective thinking impossible. They dated for 2 years. He'd been happier than he'd ever been, imaging futures that included marriage, family, a partnership built on shared values and shared work. Eleanor seemed to want the same things. They talked about buying their own property together, creating something that was theirs rather than working for her father's established operation. Then her college boyfriend had reappeared, a man named Harrison Whitmore with family money, professional success, and the kind of social polish that Marcus, despite his genuine goodness, could never quite manage. Eleanor had ended their relationship with surprising suddenness, married Harrison within 6 months, and moved to Boston, where she pursued a career in commercial real estate. The rejection itself would have hurt enough, but the aftermath had been worse. Marcus had discovered through mutual acquaintances that Eleanor had told people she'd never been seriously interested in him, that she'd been slumming, as she'd apparently phrased it, and that Marcus had simply been unable to understand the fundamental gap in their social standing. The casual cruelty of her dismissal had wounded him in ways that professional hurt could never accomplish. He'd completed his contract with Caldwell, endured the awkwardness of staying in a place where he now had to hear sympathetic comments about Eleanor's departure, and decided that the lesson was clear. People were unreliable. Relationships were painful. The safest existence was one that minimized exposure to the possibility of betrayal or loss. He'd saved aggressively, worked multiple ranch operations over 5 years, lived with meticulous frugality, and eventually accumulated enough capital to purchase the Clearwater Ranch outright. 17 years later, that decision still felt like the right one. Marcus had built a life of predictable rhythms. He maintained a herd of cattle that never disappointed him because he asked nothing of them beyond their nature. He fixed equipment that either worked or didn't based on mechanical principles that made sense. He read extensively, ordered books through the mail from a bookstore 2 counties away. He cooked for himself, hunted in season, grew vegetables in a greenhouse during the warmer months. He had everything he needed to live comfortably, and nothing that required emotional vulnerability. The isolation that would have driven most people toward desperation felt like safety to Marcus. No unexpected demands on his compassion, no risk of betrayal, no messy complications that came with human entanglement. His ranch hands were contracted employees who came and went with professional distance. His interactions with the town of Millbrook were conducted with polite minimalism. He was known as strange, unfriendly, but reliable. People left him alone, which was precisely what he wanted. This system had worked for 17 years. It had protected him from further disappointment, from the kind of vulnerability that Eleanor had used against him. It had allowed him to build a life where the only variables he couldn't control were weather and market prices, neither of which involved emotional stakes. On the evening of December 20th, 2019, Marcus was alone in his ranch house, as he had been for the vast majority of his adult life. He'd prepared dinner, a simple meal of steak and vegetables. He was reading a book about cattle genetics, making notes about potential breeding improvements he might implement in the spring. Outside, the storm was building intensity. The Weather Service had issued warnings about dangerous conditions developing, But Marcus had lived through Wyoming winters his entire life. A storm was an inconvenience, not a crisis. He'd been aware of the approaching weather system all day. It had started as rain in the afternoon, shifted to sleet by evening, and transformed into heavy snow by the time darkness fell. By 8 o'clock, visibility beyond his windows was essentially zero. The wind created drifts against the eastern side of his house, and the thermometer mounted on the porch had already dropped to 19 degrees. Marcus had checked on his cattle, confirming that they'd moved to the sheltered areas of pasture. He'd prepared for exactly this kind of weather. He'd ensured that his fuel stores were adequate, that his generator was functioning properly, that his water systems wouldn't freeze. Every contingency was covered. He'd then returned to his house, settled into his usual evening routine, and planned to be in bed by 10 o'clock. The pounding on his door around 9:15 had been shocking enough that his immediate instinct was irritation. Who would be out in conditions like this? What could possibly be important enough to interrupt his carefully structured evening? He'd moved to the door more, out of curiosity about who would be foolish, enough to attempt travel in the current conditions than out of any sense of obligation to help, when he'd opened that door and seen the woman and child standing on his porch, soaked and shaking and clearly close to critical hypothermia. His 17 years of isolation had collided with something older and deeper in his nature. The kindness that had characterized his youth hadn't disappeared over those years of deliberate solitude. It had simply been dormant, carefully suppressed as part of his larger strategy to avoid the vulnerabilities that came with caring about people. Now, faced with immediate human crisis, his suppressed instincts had overridden his protective barriers. He'd pulled them inside without asking questions, immediately recognizing the severity of their condition. The woman's lips had already begun showing the pale, waxy appearance that preceded severe hypothermia. The girl's breathing had been shallow and rapid, her skin almost blue beneath the wet clothes. Both had been minutes away from a medical emergency that Marcus's isolation would have rendered completely fatal. That moment, standing in his doorway with a shivering woman and gasping child, was the precise point at which Marcus Reed's carefully constructed, solitary existence began to crack. He didn't yet understand that this single decision to help would set in motion a chain of consequences that would transform not just his life, but his fundamental understanding of why isolation, despite its apparent safety, was ultimately a form of slower death than the risks it was designed to prevent. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency unfolded in Marcus's small house with the chaotic intensity of a situation spiraling beyond any single person's control. He'd gotten the woman and girl inside within seconds, kicked the door shut against the wind, and immediately assessed what he was dealing with. The woman was in her mid-30s, dark hair plastered to her face, her lips indeed showing that dangerous pale, waxy appearance that indicated advanced hypothermia. The girl, who appeared to be around 8 years old, had even more concerning symptoms. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, almost wheezing, and her skin had taken on a bluish tint that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with respiratory distress. Marcus had done first aid training years ago, though he'd deliberately limited his professional interactions enough that he'd never had to use it seriously. Now the training kicked in, overriding his impulse toward panic. First priority, get them out of wet clothes. Second priority, gradual rewarming. Third priority, assess the child's breathing situation. He'd guided them toward his fireplace, which he'd kept burning for the evening. The fire was warm enough to provide some immediate comfort, but not so intense that it would cause the dangerous rapid rewarming that could trigger cardiac arrest in severe hypothermia cases. He'd grabbed blankets from his couch, dry towels from his bathroom, and started removing their soaked jackets and outer layers. The woman had been too cold-shocked to object or feel embarrassment at undressing in front of a stranger. She'd simply stood where he positioned her, shaking so intensely that he'd had to steady her with one large hand while removing her wet sweater with the other. The girl had whimpered once or twice, but mostly remained compliant, understanding at some deep instinctual level that this man was helping, not harming. Once they were wrapped in dry blankets and positioned near the fireplace, Marcus had moved to the girl's breathing situation. She was still wheezing, each breath accompanied by a subtle whistling sound that indicated upper airway inflammation. The kind of sound that often accompanied severe asthma attacks or, less commonly, early-stage acute bronchitis. Either way, it wasn't something that would resolve simply through warming. "Do you have an inhaler?" Marcus had asked the woman, who by now was regaining enough cognitive function to respond coherently. The woman had nodded weakly. "In the truck, my purse. Sarah's rescue inhaler is in my purse." Marcus had looked at the girl, Sarah, who was now huddled under the blanket, her breathing becoming more labored rather than less. The inhaler was in the truck that was now completely inaccessible, stranded somewhere on that dark highway in conditions that made retrieval impossible. The roads would be closed. The snow would have buried any vehicle left exposed for more than an hour. The truck might as well have been on the moon. "What's her name?" Marcus had asked, though the woman had already answered it. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. I'm Rebecca. We were driving from Casper to visit my mother in Millbrook. The truck it stopped. The engine froze. I tried the radio, but nothing was working, so I saw your light through the storm, and we started walking." The explanation provided context Marcus didn't have time to process fully. A broken-down vehicle, a mother and child abandoning it for what must have seemed like an impossible gamble, that they could reach shelter before the cold incapacitated them. They'd succeeded in reaching him, but now they were facing a medical crisis he wasn't equipped to handle. "How often does she have attacks?" Marcus had asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Rebecca had looked at him with growing alarm, as she seemed to realize her daughter's distress was intensifying rather than improving. "Every few months. She has moderate asthma. We have inhalers at home, one in the truck, one at my mother's place. But nothing here." Marcus had made a decision in that moment that was fundamentally contrary to his 17 years of isolation protocol. He'd grabbed his car keys. "I'm going to drive to Millbrook. The hospital emergency room can get her the medication she needs. It's 40 minutes under normal conditions. In this weather, it'll take longer, but we have to try." Rebecca had started to protest, clearly understanding the danger of driving in the current conditions. "You can't, it's not safe. The roads are closed. The roads being officially closed and me driving anyway are two different things," Marcus had said, already pulling on his heavy outerwear. "The truck's four-wheel drive, and I know these roads. More importantly, your daughter needs medical attention, and there's no other option." He'd arranged them as comfortably as possible, made sure the fire was secure, given Rebecca his emergency medical kit and instructions on what to do if Sarah's breathing worsened. And then he'd stepped out into the storm. The drive to Millbrook had been genuinely dangerous in ways that would have been suicidal for most drivers. Visibility had been reduced to perhaps 20 feet. The wind had created drifts that hid the actual roadbed. More than once, Marcus had nearly driven off the side of the highway because he couldn't see where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. But he'd driven this route hundreds of times over 17 years. He'd driven it in daylight and darkness, in rain and snow and fog. He'd developed an intuitive sense of the road's curves and rises that had been honed through repetition into something almost instinctual. His hands had gripped the steering wheel with focused intensity, while his mind had calculated speed and distance and the probability that he would actually make it to the hospital before something went catastrophically wrong. He'd made it in 53 minutes, pulling into the emergency room parking lot of Millbrook Regional Hospital with a sense of relief that was quickly replaced by urgency. He'd called the hospital from the road, alerting them that he was bringing in a pediatric respiratory distress patient, so they'd been prepared. The ER staff had taken over immediately. moving Sarah with the practiced efficiency of people trained to handle medical crises. Marcus had given them Rebecca's information, learned that they would keep Sarah overnight for observation and medication management, and then face the unexpected complication of the night. Rebecca was refusing to leave her daughter, which meant Marcus would have to drive back to his ranch and retrieve the rest of their belongings from the disabled truck. It had taken him another hour to locate the vehicle on the dark highway. He'd found it exactly where Rebecca had abandoned it, buried halfway under a growing drift of new snow. He'd retrieved their luggage, Rebecca's purse with her identification and wallet, and anything else he could quickly gather. He'd then driven back to the hospital to return with news that Sarah's condition had stabilized with treatment, and that Rebecca could stay in the hospital with her. By the time Marcus had finally returned to his ranch house, it was nearly 3 in the morning. He'd been awake for over 20 hours. His adrenaline had drained away, leaving him exhausted and shaking in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd sat in front of his fireplace for an hour afterward, his mind unable to process what had happened. He'd deliberately chosen a life where he didn't have to make life-or-death decisions for strangers. He'd positioned himself far from human complications and obligations. And in a single evening, a woman and child had arrived on his porch, and he'd thrown his entire 17-year strategy into question. More disturbingly, he didn't regret it. When he'd seen that girl struggling to breathe, when he'd heard Rebecca's desperation about her daughter's medical emergency, his protective instincts had overridden every carefully constructed wall he'd built against vulnerability. He'd driven through dangerous conditions to get a child to medical care without hesitation or resentment. He'd acted based on fundamental human compassion that he'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to suppress. The question now wasn't whether he'd made the right choice in helping. The question was, what happened when someone who'd built an entire life around isolation suddenly discovered that compassion didn't disappear just because you tried to starve it? What happened when the walls you'd constructed with such deliberate care developed cracks that you weren't sure how to repair? Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkness of his living room, listening to the storm continue its assault on his house, and wondered if his quiet, predictable existence had just experienced an interruption that would prove impossible to recover from. Marcus called the hospital at 7 in the morning, needing confirmation that Sarah had survived the night and that his emergency rescue hadn't simply delayed an inevitable tragedy. The nurse who answered had been professionally cheerful, reporting that Sarah was stable. Her oxygen levels had improved significantly with treatment, and she was expected to be discharged by afternoon, pending the doctor's final assessment. The relief he felt was quickly tempered by the realization that relief brought obligations. Rebecca and Sarah would need transportation back to his ranch. They would need somewhere to stay until roads could be cleared, and they could resume their interrupted journey to visit Rebecca's mother. Marcus had no guest room prepared, no supplies stocked for overnight visitors, no infrastructure designed to accommodate people beyond himself. He drove to the hospital in the early afternoon to find Rebecca looking exhausted but relieved. She was sitting in Sarah's room, while the girl ate hospital food with the uncomplicated appetite of someone who'd survived a medical crisis and was now on the recovery side of it. Sarah looked up when Marcus entered, something that might have been recognition or gratitude or simply acknowledgement of the man who'd driven her through a blizzard flickering across her young face. "Thank you," Rebecca said immediately, standing to greet him. "I don't know what we would have done without you. The roads are still closed. The emergency services said it could be 2 or 3 days before they're clear enough for regular traffic." Marcus had nodded, understanding the implication without needing it stated explicitly. 2 or 3 days meant Rebecca and Sarah couldn't leave. They would need to stay somewhere, and the nearest functional hotel was in Millbrook. 12 miles away, through roads that were still partially blocked with snow. "You'll stay at the ranch," Marcus had said, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully thought through the implications. "It's not far. You can have the guest room. I'll get you back to your mother's as soon as the roads are passable. Rebecca had looked uncertain, clearly understanding that accepting such an offer meant depending on a stranger's hospitality for an extended period. But what alternative did she have? A hotel room would be expensive, probably more than her emergency funds could support. Staying in the hospital wasn't an option once Sarah was medically cleared. The weather outside was still hazardous. "That's incredibly kind," Rebecca had finally said. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Marcus had replied, finding the sentiment both true and inadequate. The drive back to the ranch had been quiet. Sarah had dozed in the back seat, her breathing now normal, no hint of the wheezing that had driven the night's crisis. Rebecca had stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape, occasionally making observations about the beauty of the Wyoming terrain, to which Marcus had offered minimal responses. He wasn't accustomed to conversation, to the social reciprocity that required him to ask questions and listen to answers and contribute to dialogue beyond basic necessity. The ranch house, which had felt entirely adequate for a single person, suddenly seemed inadequate for three. Marcus had shown them to his guest room, a space he rarely entered, furnished with functional basics but lacking the lived-in comfort of the rest of the house. He'd stocked the bathroom with clean towels and found an old space heater to combat the chill that accumulated in unused rooms. That first evening had been awkward. Marcus had prepared dinner, a simple meal of beef stew and bread. Rebecca had tried to help, offering to assist with cooking or cleaning, but Marcus had found her presence in his kitchen disruptive to his established rhythms. He'd politely declined, creating an uncomfortable dynamic where she understood herself to be a burden rather than a contributor. They'd eaten together at his dining table, something Marcus did alone every evening. The addition of two other people had transformed the meal from a simple fuel intake into a social event that required navigation. Sarah had been talkative, asking questions about the ranch, about the animals, about how Marcus had come to live so far from other people. Rebecca had gently redirected some of Sarah's questions, attempting to prevent the girl from imposing too much curiosity on their host. Marcus had answered what he could, finding that brief engagement with Sarah's genuine interest in his world was less exhausting than he'd expected. There was no agenda to a child's questions, no hidden judgment or evaluation. She simply wanted to understand how things worked. The second day had brought unexpected complications. Marcus had woken to the sound of Sarah coughing, not the dangerous wheezing of respiratory distress, but a productive cough that suggested lingering irritation in her airways. He'd gone to check on her, finding Rebecca already awake and holding Sarah close, monitoring her daughter's symptoms with the vigilant attention of a parent who'd just experienced medical trauma. The hospital said residual coughing for a few days was normal. Rebecca had explained when she saw Marcus in the doorway, "As long as her breathing stays clear and her oxygen levels remain good, it's just her body healing." Marcus had nodded and returned to his morning routine, but the sound of Sarah's cough had stayed with him. Coupled with Rebecca's obvious anxiety about her daughter's continued recovery, it reinforced the reality that these two people would remain dependent on his space and resources for at least the next 2 days, possibly longer if weather conditions worsened. By afternoon, the complications had escalated beyond simple discomfort with having guests. Marcus had received a phone call from his ranch manager, David Hendricks, who was supposed to arrive the following day to manage a routine veterinary appointment for some of the cattle. Hendricks was a practical man in his 50s who'd worked for Marcus for 6 years with minimal personal interaction beyond what was necessary for the job. "I saw the weather reports," Hendricks had said. "Roads are still pretty rough. I can push the vet appointment to next week if that works better for you." "That would be fine," Marcus had replied, then hesitated. "Actually, we have guests at the ranch right now. A woman and her daughter were stranded in the storm last night. They're staying until roads clear." There had been a pause on the line, and Marcus could almost hear Hendricks's surprise. David had worked for Marcus long enough to know that unexpected guests violated every principle of how the rancher had structured his existence. "Everything okay?" Hendricks had asked carefully. They needed shelter. "The girl has asthma." They didn't have anywhere else to go, Marcus had explained, finding the justification necessary, even though he owed none. Hendricks had accepted the explanation without further comment. But the conversation had reinforced something Marcus was beginning to understand. His sudden shift from isolation to hospitality was notable enough to require explanation. It contradicted the image people had of Marcus Reed, the solitary rancher who preferred his own company to human interaction. That evening, Rebecca had asked a question that had struck at the heart of Marcus's internal conflict. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she'd asked casually while they were eating dinner. Sarah was in the guest room, resting after the activity of the day. 17 years, Marcus had replied, then added more than he normally would have. "I bought the property specifically for the isolation." Rebecca had nodded thoughtfully, not immediately offering judgment or advice, simply processing the information. "That's a long time to live without much human contact. It's what I chose," Marcus had said, something in his tone suggesting the topic was closed. But Rebecca had continued gently. "It seems like you're pretty good at helping people, even if you've been avoiding doing it. The way you responded to us in the storm, the way you drove Sarah to the hospital. Someone who was genuinely committed to isolation wouldn't have done those things." Marcus hadn't answered immediately. The truth was complicated. He'd responded to Rebecca and Sarah not because he'd deliberately chosen compassion over self-protection, but because his instinctive human decency had overridden his carefully constructed defenses. That wasn't virtue. It was the simple reality of what happened when someone's protective walls encountered genuine crisis. "Maybe that's the problem," he'd finally said. "Maybe I'm not actually cut out for isolation. But I've spent so long preparing for it that I don't know how to do anything else." The admission had hung between them, uncomfortable and honest in ways that Marcus didn't typically allow himself to be. The roads officially reopened on the afternoon of the third day. The State Highway Department had worked through the night to clear the main routes, using salt and sand to create passable conditions. By noon, travel advisories had been downgraded from avoid all travel to exercise caution. Rebecca had received word from the hospital that Sarah's follow-up appointment confirmed her. Respiratory function had returned to baseline, and she was cleared for travel. Everything about the situation suggested that this temporary intrusion into Marcus's life should be ending. Rebecca and Sarah could leave. The obligation would be fulfilled. Marcus could return to his established rhythms and structured solitude. It should have been straightforward. Instead, Rebecca had called her mother to confirm arrival times, and the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Through the bedroom door, Marcus had heard Rebecca's voice shifting from normal greeting into something more concerned. He hadn't deliberately eavesdropped, but the ranch house was small enough that private conversations remained partially audible. "Mom, you sound exhausted," Rebecca had said. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" The response had been inaudible to Marcus, but Rebecca's next words had clarified the situation's new dimension. "No, we can definitely stay longer. Don't worry about us. Your health is more important than me visiting on schedule." After disconnecting, Rebecca had found Marcus in the kitchen where he was preparing lunch. Her expression had been conflicted, clearly caught between gratitude for a temporary solution and anxiety about whatever situation awaited at her mother's house. "My mother has pneumonia," Rebecca had explained without preamble. "She was supposed to be recovering while I visited, but apparently she got worse instead of better. Her doctor recommended she not have visitors for at least another week to avoid any risk of complications from exposure to illness. So we can't go there right now." The implication was obvious. They needed to stay at the ranch longer. Marcus had felt the familiar tension rising in his chest, the sensation of his carefully maintained boundaries being pushed outward by circumstances beyond his control. He'd already violated his 17-year protocol by allowing guests. Extending that violation indefinitely felt like stepping across a threshold from which there would be no return. How long? He'd asked, already knowing the answer would be longer than he wanted. At least a week. Maybe 2, depending on how quickly Mom recovers. Rebecca had watched his face carefully. I know this is asking a lot. We can figure out alternatives if it's too much. There might be a motel we could afford in town. Marcus had recognized the offer as genuine, but also recognized it for what it was. An escape hatch that would make him feel less obligated while simultaneously abandoning a woman and child to inadequate shelter for 2 weeks because his personal comfort had been disrupted. The contradiction had infuriated him, not at Rebecca but at himself. "Stay," he'd said more sharply than he'd intended. "You need to be here. Sarah needs consistency. You can stay." The tension between them had remained unresolved through dinner. Marcus had found himself aware of every moment Rebecca and Sarah occupied his space. The way Sarah's cough still occasionally interrupted conversations. The way Rebecca had reorganized his kitchen slightly, putting things in more logical locations without asking permission. The way his solitary evening routine had been completely dismantled by the presence of other people requiring accommodation. That night, Marcus had paced his bedroom for hours. He'd made a terrible mistake in inviting them to stay at all. He'd allowed compassion to override practical judgment, and now he was trapped in a situation where every instinct told him to re-establish his boundaries while every vestige of basic human decency told him that such boundaries had become unjustifiable. Cruelty. The 4th day had brought an external complication that had forced the internal conflict into sharper focus. David. Hendricks had arrived in the morning to reschedule the veterinary appointment. He'd seen Rebecca and Sarah in the living room when Marcus let him in, and his professional expression had shifted into something approaching curiosity. Marcus had made brief introductions, attempting to normalize the situation while understanding that normality and Marcus Reed hosting long-term guests were contradictory concepts in Hendricks's understanding. After completing the appointment scheduling, Hendricks had lingered, clearly wanting to broach a topic but uncertain of how to approach it. That woman and girl, they staying long? Hendricks had finally asked. Her mother's sick. They can't travel for a couple weeks, Marcus had replied, unsure why he felt defensive about the explanation. Hendricks had nodded slowly. So they'll be here through Christmas then. Christmas was 5 days away. The realization hit Marcus with the force of actual physical impact. Rebecca and Sarah would still be at the ranch during the holidays. He would spend Christmas, which he'd spent alone for 17 years, with other people. The thought had triggered a cascade of anxiety that he couldn't entirely suppress. After Hendricks left, Marcus had found himself unable to focus on ranch work. He'd attempted to check on the cattle, but his mind had remained circling the same anxious thoughts. By afternoon, he'd returned to the house to find Sarah and Rebecca baking cookies in his kitchen, using ingredients Rebecca had asked permission to purchase during a trip into Millbrook. The kitchen had smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, scents that had never inhabited this space during his 17 years of residence. Sarah had been decorating cookies with frosting, her tongue poking out in concentration. Rebecca had been laughing at something Sarah had said, a sound of genuine joy that seemed to belong in Marcus's isolated house about as much as Christmas lights belonged in his carefully controlled existence. "Can you help?" Sarah had asked, holding up a cookie shaped like a pine tree. "I need someone tall to put this one on the highest shelf." Marcus had felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the resistance to being drawn into their activities, the protective impulse to maintain emotional distance. But Sarah was looking at him with uncomplicated trust and hope. Rebecca was watching him with something that might have been understanding of his discomfort or might have been testing whether his initial kindness had been genuine or situational. He'd taken the cookie and placed it on the highest shelf of his kitchen cabinet, a shelf he'd never before needed to use for anything. Sarah had clapped her hands together with delight. "Now we're a team," she'd announced. Teams are better than people being alone. The simple statement had cut through Marcus's resistance with surprising effectiveness. He'd spent 17 years arguing that being alone was better than teams, that isolation was preferable to human entanglement, that solitude protected against disappointment and betrayal. And in 4 days, an 8-year-old girl had presented a counter-argument that was harder to dismiss than any rational debate could have been. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Rebecca had broached the conversation Marcus had been avoiding. "This is really hard for you, isn't it?" she'd said quietly. "Having us here, having to share your space and your routine." Marcus hadn't attempted to deny it. "I built my life specifically to avoid this kind of situation. Other people create complications. They require compromise. They make demands on your time and attention." Rebecca had nodded thoughtfully. "And 17 years of that seemed better than the risk of letting people close." "Yes," Marcus had answered honestly. "When you let people in, they can hurt you." Distance seemed like the safer choice. Rebecca had been quiet for a long moment. "I understand that logic. My ex-husband taught me that lesson. After he left, I seriously considered moving to a place where I wouldn't have to risk depending on anyone ever again. But I have Sarah, and she needs me to model something different. She needs to see that some risks are worth taking, that human connection matters more than perfect safety." She'd paused, then added carefully, "What you did in the storm, driving through dangerous conditions to help a stranger's child. That wasn't someone committed to isolation. That was someone whose true nature is compassion, even if you've spent 17 years trying to convince yourself otherwise." Marcus had felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd carefully sealed off when Eleanor had rejected him. The possibility that isolation wasn't actually protective, that it was simply a different kind of slow death. That his 17 years of solitude weren't evidence of wisdom, but rather evidence of prolonged self-abandonment. The days immediately following Rebecca's confrontation were marked by a subtle shift in how Marcus moved through his own house. He didn't suddenly transform into a gregarious person or abandon his natural reserve, but something about his resistance had softened. The cookie-making incident had become metaphor for something larger. Sarah's intuitive wisdom, that teams were better than solitude, had lodged itself in his thinking, impossible to ignore or dismiss. On the 6th day of their stay, Marcus found himself doing something he hadn't done since Eleanor's departure 17 years earlier. He asked for help with something beyond practical necessity. He was attempting to repair the greenhouse that had fallen into partial disrepair during the years he'd maintained it alone, and he'd recognized that the project required an extra set of hands. Rebecca had come out to assist without hesitation, working alongside him to replace damaged panels and seal gaps where cold air leaked through. They'd worked in companionable silence for most of the morning, the rhythm of shared labor creating its own form of communication. Sarah had stayed inside, resting after her residual cough had flared up slightly with the exertion of playing outside. By afternoon, they'd made significant progress. Marcus had realized that with Rebecca's help, he'd accomplished in 1 day what would have taken him a week working alone. The efficiency had struck him as obvious in retrospect, but somehow foreign to how he'd been operating for 17 years. "You're actually pretty good at this," Rebecca had commented while wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "Teamwork, I mean. You don't seem like someone who's uncomfortable with it when it's actually happening. You're uncomfortable with the idea of needing it." Marcus had considered her observation while securing the final panel. She was right. When he was engaged in actual collaboration, his resistance dissolved. It was the philosophical commitment to isolation that was the problem, not the practical reality of working alongside someone. He'd built an entire world-view around self-sufficiency that had nothing to do with the actual satisfaction of shared accomplishment. That evening, Marcus had made an unexpected decision. He'd called David Hendricks and asked him to postpone all ranch work for the next 2 weeks. The cattle were secure, the property was properly maintained, and nothing urgently required Hendricks's attention. What did require attention was that Marcus had spent 17 years avoiding what his presence in this conversation now represented. The possibility that he could be part of something beyond himself. For the first time, Marcus had consciously chosen to protect his guests' presence at the ranch, rather than anxiously count down their departure. The turning point came on the 9th day, 3 days before Christmas. Sarah had woken in the night with coughing that had quickly progressed beyond residual symptoms into something more concerning. By the time Marcus heard her distressed breathing, he'd understood that her asthma was flaring again, possibly triggered by the exertion of the previous days or by some other environmental factor. His isolated existence hadn't required him to understand. Rebecca had already been awake, monitoring Sarah's symptoms, anxiety evident in her movements. Her mother's condition was still precarious, making her unable to help. Sarah needed medication that neither of them had access to. The hospital in Millbrook was the only option, though this time the roads were clear, and the drive would take 40 minutes in normal conditions. Marcus had dressed rapidly and driven Sarah to the hospital while Rebecca remained at the ranch. Her anxiety about being separated from her daughter warring with the practical reality that someone needed to stay available to receive calls with updates. In the emergency room, Sarah had been treated by the same staff who'd assisted her the first time, their recognition suggesting they remembered both the situation and Marcus's willingness to drive through dangerous conditions to ensure she received necessary care. This time, the treatment had been faster, the protocol established. Sarah had been prescribed a new preventive inhaler to use daily, along with guidance about environmental triggers and activity levels during her recovery. By morning, she'd been cleared for discharge, with instructions for careful monitoring over the next week. When Marcus had brought her back to the ranch, Rebecca had been waiting on the porch despite the cold, desperate to confirm her daughter's well-being in person. She'd held Sarah close, tears streaming down her face, the kind of primal relief that only a parent who'd experienced medical crisis with their child could truly understand. That afternoon, Rebecca had approached Marcus with a proposition that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of their stay. "My mother called this morning," she'd explained. "The doctor says she's turned a corner with the pneumonia. She's not contagious anymore, but she's still weak and needs assistance with recovery. She asked if we could stay here a bit longer, maybe another week, before we head to her place. She wants to rest and recover without the disruption of visitors right now." Marcus had understood the actual question beneath the stated one. Rebecca was asking whether he wanted them to leave now that the initial emergency had passed, or whether he was willing to extend their stay beyond the immediate crisis that had justified it. She was offering him an exit, while simultaneously asking him to choose continued engagement rather than return to his established pattern. The old Marcus, the version who'd purchased this ranch specifically for solitude, would have accepted the opportunity to return to his previous existence. He could have driven Rebecca and Sarah to Millbrook, helped them get settled, and resumed his isolated routine within days. Instead, Marcus heard himself say, "Stay through Christmas. Your mother needs you healthy and rested before you go to her place, and Sarah should remain in one environment while her asthma stabilizes." "It makes medical sense." Rebecca had smiled, and Marcus had recognized that she understood his justification was practical framing for a more fundamental truth. He wanted them to stay, not out of obligation, but out of genuine preference for their presence over the return to solitude he'd initially considered desirable. That evening, Marcus had done something else he hadn't done since Eleanor's departure. He'd purchased a Christmas tree. He'd driven into Millbrook, selected a moderately sized evergreen from a roadside lot, and brought it back to the ranch, without fully understanding why he was undertaking the project. Sarah's response had provided the answer. Her face had transformed with joy at the sight of the tree being carried through the door. She'd immediately begun planning decorations. Enlisting Rebecca's help, and after a moment's hesitation, asking Marcus if he had any ornaments stored somewhere. He'd gone to his storage closet and found a single box containing Christmas decorations from his childhood. Items he'd packed away when he'd moved to the ranch but never unpacked. Inside were handmade ornaments, strings of lights that predated modern technology, and photographs of Christmases past where his younger self stood in front of decorated trees surrounded by family members who were now distant. Presences in his life. Sarah had handled the ornaments with reverent care, asking questions about each one. Marcus had found himself answering with more detail than he typically shared, describing his mother, his childhood. The years before his commitment to solitude had calcified into permanent isolation. By the time they'd finished decorating, the tree had transformed his living room into something unrecognizable from the minimalist, emotionally barren space it had been for 17 years. The lights cast warm glows across the room. The ornaments represented decades of accumulated meaning. Sarah had hung a new ornament she'd made at school before the storm, creating a bridge between the past Marcus had been running from and the present he was being invited to inhabit. That night, Marcus had sat alone after Rebecca and Sarah had gone to bed. He'd looked at the decorated tree and understood with sudden clarity that his 17 years of isolation hadn't been about safety or wisdom. They'd been about running from the possibility that he might be hurt again, that vulnerability might lead to betrayal, that opening his heart could result in the kind of rejection that Eleanor had inflicted, but running from vulnerability hadn't actually protected him. It had simply extended the original wound, turning it from a single devastating moment into 17 years of slow self-abandonment. It had taken a woman and child stranded in a blizzard to crack through his defenses, enough that he could begin to understand the difference between protecting himself and destroying himself in the process. The question now wasn't whether he could survive returning to isolation after this. The question was whether he was willing to continue surviving in isolation when the cost had become so apparent. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of clear, cold perfection that only high Wyoming elevations could deliver. The previous night's snow had dusted the landscape in fresh white, and the sun rose over the eastern ridges to illuminate a world that looked fundamentally transformed from the one that had existed 3 weeks earlier. Marcus woke before dawn, a habit so ingrained that 17 years of isolation hadn't altered it. But instead of the quiet solitude he was accustomed to, he heard movement in the kitchen. Rebecca was already awake, preparing breakfast with the kind of competent efficiency that suggested she'd mentally planned the meal days in advance. Sarah emerged from her room still drowsy, her attention immediately caught by the wrapped presents Marcus had placed beneath the tree the night before. He'd spent considerable time selecting items for her, books about ranching, a quality pair of work gloves sized for a child, art supplies, and a silver bracelet that had belonged to his mother, something he'd never expected to part with but found himself wanting Sarah to have anyway. The gift-giving had created an intimate vulnerability that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Choosing presents for people required understanding their interests and preferences at a level deeper than casual accommodation. It required genuine attention to who they were as individuals. He discovered through this process that Sarah loved learning about how things worked, that she had artistic inclinations despite her young age, and that she wore jewelry with the careful attention of someone who understood objects could carry meaning beyond their material value. Rebecca had insisted on cooking Christmas dinner, a meal that expanded throughout the day into something elaborate and time-consuming. Marcus found himself drawn into the kitchen repeatedly, drawn not by obligation, but by genuine interest in watching someone prepare food with such intentionality. Rebecca had learned his tastes over the 3 weeks, but she also pushed his culinary preferences gently outward, introducing him to dishes that expanded beyond his established patterns. In the afternoon, after presents had been opened and the initial excitement had settled, Rebecca had suggested they take a walk around the property. Sarah had remained inside, contentedly engaged with one of her new books, while Rebecca and Marcus had bundled against the cold and ventured out into the bright clarity of the winter afternoon. They'd walked without particular destination, moving across frozen ground toward the rise that overlooked the valley where the ranch was situated. From that vantage point, the entire property was visible. The house, the barns, the corrals, the fields stretching outward toward the horizon. The landscape that had felt like sanctuary to Marcus for 17 years now looked different. It still possessed beauty and grandeur, but something about it seemed less like refuge and more like incomplete potential. "You never answered my question," Rebecca had said, settling onto a snow-covered rock, "about why you drove through dangerous conditions to help us that first night. Most people in your position would have called for help and stayed inside. But you went out into that storm." Marcus had considered the question while watching the afternoon light play across the snow. "I think I acted based on something older than my 17 years of isolation. Something from before I decided that people were fundamentally unreliable. When I was younger, helping people felt natural. I didn't question it or calculate the risk. I just responded to need, and then Eleanor happened," Rebecca had said quietly. "One person betrayed you, and you responded by rejecting the entire concept of human connection." Marcus had nodded. It seemed logical at the time. Remove the possibility of disappointment by removing myself from situations where disappointment could occur. But I didn't account for the fact that the disappointment I was avoiding was actually less painful than the quiet devastation of 17 years spent alone. Rebecca had reached over and taken his hand, a gesture so simple and so profound that Marcus had felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of his own capacity for connection. For 17 years, he'd avoided any touch beyond handshakes. Physical contact had represented vulnerability he wasn't willing to accept. But Rebecca's hand in his felt like coming home to a place he'd abandoned so long ago that he'd almost forgotten it existed. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Marcus had made a phone call he'd been considering for days. He'd contacted his mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in person for over 3 years, maintaining their relationship through sparse emails and the occasional holiday greeting. The conversation had been awkward initially, his mother clearly shocked to hear him on the phone rather than receiving his customary typed message. But he'd explained the situation, the storm, Rebecca and Sarah's arrival, the decision to help, the dawning recognition that his isolation hadn't been wisdom, but rather an extended expression of fear. His mother had listened quietly, and when she'd finally responded, her words had carried the weight of accumulated years of concern about her son's solitary existence. "I've always worried that you were running," she'd said, "that Eleanor's rejection had made you believe all connections were inherently dangerous. But you were such a loving child, Marcus, so willing to help others, so naturally kind. I never understood how you could have become someone so determined to be alone." After the call, Marcus had sat in his living room with the Christmas tree still lit, its warm glow casting shadows across the space that had been emotionally barren for so long. He'd understood that his mother had been worried about him for the entire duration of his isolation, that his distance had caused her pain equal to but opposite from the pain Eleanor's rejection had caused him. In running from vulnerability, he'd wounded the people who actually cared about him while convincing himself he was being wise. The final days of Rebecca and Sarah's stay took on a quality of deliberate presence. Marcus was acutely aware that their time at the ranch was ending. Rebecca's mother had completed her initial recovery, and the roads remained clear. There was no legitimate reason for them to remain beyond a week into January. The original crisis that had justified their presence had long since resolved. What remained was simply the question of whether Marcus would allow connection to continue beyond necessity, or whether he would retreat back into the safety of his familiar isolation. He'd made his answer clear through actions rather than words. He'd invited them to stay longer, offered to drive them to Rebecca's mother's house when they were ready, rather than expecting them to arrange their own transportation, and began discussing the possibility of regular visits throughout the year. The framework of their relationship was shifting from temporary necessity to chosen relationship. David Hendricks had arrived one afternoon for ranch work and had immediately noticed the transformation. The decorated tree was still standing, though slightly drooping, as fresh needles fell to the floor. The living room showed evidence of habitation beyond Marcus's solitary routines, books left open on tables, a child's drawing displayed on the refrigerator, cooking supplies and ingredients occupying space in the kitchen that had previously held only minimal provisions. "Looks like you're different," Hendricks had observed quietly. "In a good way. You look less like you're surviving and more like you're actually living." Marcus hadn't attempted to deny or minimize the observation. He'd simply acknowledged that yes, something had fundamentally shifted, that the 17 years he'd spent protecting himself from vulnerability had actually been a form of profound self-abandonment, that it had taken a woman and child, stranded in a blizzard, to remind him that the opposite of isolation wasn't chaos. It was connection, purpose, and the complicated but ultimately rewarding engagement with other human beings. The realization wasn't magical or complete. Marcus remained fundamentally reserved by temperament. He still preferred quiet to noise, solitude to crowds, and structured routines to spontaneous social engagement. But he'd understood the crucial distinction between being a person who valued internal contemplation and being a person who was running from the possibility of being hurt. That distinction would define everything that came. Next January arrived with the particular harshness that only the high plains could deliver. The brief respite of Christmas had given way to sustained cold that made outdoor work brutally difficult and pushed the ranch's infrastructure to its limits. Marcus had adjusted his daily routines to accommodate both the weather demands and the ongoing presence of Rebecca and Sarah, who had extended their stay through mid-January as Rebecca's mother completed her recovery and Rebecca herself struggled with the reality that their time at the ranch was genuinely ending. The transition from crisis-driven necessity to chosen relationship had proved more complicated than Marcus had anticipated. Without the immediate medical emergencies or the clear deadline of roads reopening, the dynamic between them had shifted into something more ambiguous. Rebecca was aware that Marcus had fundamentally changed his relationship to isolation, but she was also realistic about what his reserved nature meant for any long-term possibilities between them. They hadn't explicitly discussed what would happen after Rebecca and Sarah departed. Marcus found himself unable to articulate what he wanted beyond vague sense that he didn't want this connection to end simply because the circumstances that had created it had resolved. Rebecca seemed to hold similar unspoken hopes, but also seemed cautious about articulating them, perhaps protecting both herself and Sarah from disappointment if Marcus ultimately discovered that genuine long-term commitment was beyond what his 17 years of isolation had prepared him for. The complication had emerged on a Tuesday afternoon, when Rebecca received a phone call from her employer in Casper. She'd taken a leave of absence during the medical crisis with her mother and the subsequent complications with Sarah's asthma. Her job as a pediatric nurse had been held for her, but the hospital was requesting her return to work by early February. The position was stable and provided health insurance that Sarah's asthma required. It was also 3 hours away from the ranch, requiring either daily commuting or some arrangement that would separate them most weekdays. That evening, Rebecca had mentioned it to Marcus with careful casualness that hadn't masked her anxiety. The job offer was presented as practical fact, but her expression had revealed the weight of the decision she was facing. She could return to her life in Casper, maintaining distance from Marcus while retaining professional stability and her established social support network. Or she could attempt to figure out how to maintain her connection to the ranch and to Marcus, while managing a job that wasn't geographically compatible with either. Marcus had felt the familiar panic that arose when faced with decisions that required him to articulate commitment beyond theoretical possibility. His instinct had been to offer practical solutions. She could commute, or she could find work in Millbrook, or any of a dozen suggestions that would allow him to avoid explicitly stating that he wanted her to stay. But that impulse had felt like the beginning of a retreat into the patterns that had defined his isolation. If he continued avoiding explicit vulnerability, he would communicate through his hesitation that his transformation had limits, that when genuine commitment demanded actual sacrifice, his willingness would evaporate. Instead, Marcus had taken a breath and said something he'd never imagined saying, "I don't want you to leave. I understand the job is important and the stability it provides matters. But I would prefer that you stay here, that we figure out a solution that keeps you and Sarah in this place." The statement had hung between them, simple and terrifying in its directness. Rebecca's expression had shifted through several emotions before settling into something that looked like cautious hope mixed with practical concern. "That's not a simple request," she'd finally said. "This is real life, Marcus, not a holiday interlude. Long-term commitment requires compromise and sacrifice from both of us. Are you actually prepared for that? Or are you going to discover 6 months from now that you miss your isolation too much to maintain this?" Marcus had recognized the question as fair and necessary. She was protecting both herself and Sarah by forcing him to confront the reality of what he was proposing. If he committed to them staying, he was committing to a life fundamentally different from the one he'd constructed. He was committing to ongoing compromise, to sharing his space and his resources, to making decisions based on other people's needs and preferences alongside his own. The old Marcus would have retreated at this point, providing some version of "I need more time to think about this" that would have essentially been a gentle rejection. The Marcus who stood in his kitchen at that moment recognized the choice for what it was. Either he committed to genuine vulnerability, or he admitted that his transformation was superficial, that when actual consequences emerged, he would revert to his protective patterns. "I can't promise I'll be perfect at this," he'd said carefully. "I don't have 17 years of practice at sharing my life with other people. I'll probably be difficult and reserved and occasionally need time alone. But yes, I'm asking you to stay, not as guests, but as people who matter to me. I'm asking you to help me build something different than what I've had, even though I'm terrified of failing at it." Rebecca's eyes had filled with tears, and she'd moved toward him in a way that had felt like acceptance rather than just emotional response. She'd called her employer the next morning and resigned from the pediatric position in Casper. She'd then begun the process of seeking employment at Millbrook Regional Hospital, a smaller facility with less demanding schedules and significantly shorter commute times. The decision had created immediate practical complications. Rebecca needed housing in Millbrook, close enough for manageable commuting. She'd initially suggested renting an apartment in town, maintaining some independence from Marcus's ranch while still being geographically close. But Marcus had surprised himself by proposing something more substantial: move into the master bedroom. "I'll take the smaller room. This is your home now if you want it to be. Sarah needs space that's hers. You need space that's yours. But the ranch should be your residence, not just a place you visit." The proposal had been significant enough that Rebecca had asked for time to consider it. She'd needed to ensure she wasn't making decisions based on the intensity of emotion rather than realistic assessment of what long-term cohabitation would actually require. She'd consulted with her mother, discussed the implications with Sarah, and ultimately had returned to Marcus with a modified proposal. "We'll move in, but we need to establish clear boundaries and routines. This needs to be intentional, not just reactive to crisis or emotional intensity. If we're going to make this work, we need to approach it like actual partners, rather than people caught in an emergency situation. Marcus had agreed entirely. They'd spent several evenings planning how the ranch house would be reorganized. Rebecca and Sarah would have their own spaces, clearly defined and genuinely private. The common areas would be reorganized to reflect three people's needs, rather than one person's carefully controlled systems. Routines would be established that acknowledged Marcus's need for structure and solitude, alongside Sarah's childlike needs for attention and engagement, and Rebecca's professional requirements. The actual move had occurred in the final week of January. Rebecca had retrieved their belongings from storage in Casper and had arranged for her mother to travel to the ranch to meet Marcus and Sarah's new home. The visit had been significant. Rebecca's mother, Catherine, had been understandably cautious about her daughter moving in with a man she'd known only through stories and a brief hospital encounter. But she'd spent 2 days at the ranch observing how Marcus interacted with Sarah, how he and Rebecca communicated, and how genuinely he'd transformed his entire existence to accommodate their presence. On her final morning, Catherine had pulled Marcus aside while Rebecca and Sarah were occupied with other tasks. "I was worried when Rebecca told me she was moving here," she'd said quietly. "Worried that you were just lonely, and that she was providing temporary companionship that would fade. But I can see that something genuine has shifted in how you exist in the world. You're not perfect, and you'll probably frustrate each other regularly. But you've chosen to let people matter to you, and that's not a small thing." After Catherine's departure, Marcus had faced the reality of his transformed existence. Rebecca and Sarah were now permanent residents. His daily routines had been fundamentally altered. His solitude had been replaced by the ongoing presence of other people. The ranch, which had been a sanctuary from human complication, had become a home shared by 3 people with overlapping but distinct needs and preferences. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been moments of tension when Marcus's reserved nature conflicted with Rebecca's more emotionally expressive communication style. There had been occasions when Sarah's childhood energy had grated against his preference for quiet. There had been disagreements about resource allocation and decision-making authority. But beneath the complications, something substantial was being built. Something that hadn't existed in Marcus's life for 17 years. Genuine partnership, authentic belonging, and the complicated but ultimately rewarding reality of mattering to other people beyond the abstractions of isolated philosophy. By February, the ranch had undergone transformations beyond simple domestic reorganization. Rebecca had secured employment at Millbrook Regional Hospital, working a schedule that allowed her to be home by early evening most days. Her pediatric nursing background had proven valuable, and her colleagues had quickly recognized her competence and dedication. Sarah had been enrolled in the local elementary school, a 15-minute drive from the ranch, creating new routines and new rhythms that organized their collective existence around 3 overlapping schedules. The physical space of the house reflected these changes. Sarah's room had been painted in colors she'd selected, decorated with artwork she created, filled with books and learning materials that represented her expanding curiosity about the world. Rebecca's professional workspace had been established in what had previously been Marcus's unused formal dining room, a space where she could manage paperwork and communicate with colleagues without disrupting the household's shared areas. Marcus's own spaces had been modified to maintain the solitude he genuinely needed while remaining accessible to his new family. The most significant transformation had occurred in how Marcus approached his ranch work. For 17 years, he'd maintained the property with efficient minimalism, doing only what was necessary for basic functionality and modest profitability. But Rebecca's presence had sparked conversations about what the ranch could become if approached with more ambition. She'd asked questions about his long-term vision, challenged his assumption that the property should remain static, and suggested possibilities he'd never considered. One afternoon in late February, While they were reviewing the ranch's financial statements, Rebecca had posed a question that seemed simple but carried significant implications. What would you do with this place if you believed you could actually succeed at something challenging? Marcus had found the question disarming in its directness. He'd spent 17 years operating from a philosophy of minimal ambition, a self-protective approach that reduced the possibility of failure by refusing to attempt anything ambitious. But Rebecca's presence had disrupted that protective strategy. If he could open his heart to another person despite the risk of rejection, why couldn't he risk professional ambition alongside that vulnerability? Over the following weeks, Marcus and Rebecca had begun planning a transformation of the Clearwater Ranch into something more substantial. The property had potential that Marcus had never fully developed. The water from the natural springs could support expanded agricultural operations. The landscape contained areas suitable for agritourism development. Guests could pay to experience genuine ranch life, participate in cattle operations, learn about sustainable land management. Educational programs could be developed for school groups interested in understanding agricultural practices and environmental stewardship. It was ambitious, requiring capital investment and professional expertise that Marcus didn't possess. But it was also exciting in ways that his 17 years of isolated minimalism had never been. Rebecca had connections in the agricultural business world through her previous professional networks. David Hendricks had suggested contacts in sustainable agriculture who might serve as consultants. Even Catherine, Rebecca's mother, had offered to provide financing if the business plan demonstrated genuine potential. By mid-March, they'd contracted with an agricultural consultant named Thomas Wheeler, a man in his 60s who'd spent decades developing agritourism operations throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Wheeler had arrived at the ranch with detailed assessment tools and had spent 2 days examining the property, reviewing the existing operation, and understanding Marcus's vision for what it could become. His evaluation had been encouraging but realistic. The Clearwater Ranch possessed the geographic advantage of being isolated enough for authentic rural experience while remaining accessible enough for actual visitor traffic. The water resources were exceptional for the region. The infrastructure, though aging, was sound. The biggest limitation was Marcus's own mindset about what was possible. You've been operating this place like it's a cost to maintain rather than an asset to develop, Wheeler had said bluntly during his final presentation. You have everything required to build something significant here. What you're lacking is the willingness to believe in the possibility. The comment had struck Marcus with particular force because it articulated something he'd been recognizing but hadn't fully acknowledged. His isolation hadn't just been about emotional protection. It had been about professional minimalism as well, a comprehensive avoidance of ambition that extended across every dimension of his existence. Rebecca's arrival had begun disrupting that protective minimalism, and Wheeler's assessment had crystallized how thoroughly Marcus had constrained his own potential. Over the following month, they developed a detailed business plan for the ranch's expansion. The first phase would involve renovating several outbuildings into modest guest accommodations. The second phase would develop educational programming around sustainable ranching practices. The third phase, if successful, would expand into broader agritourism offerings, including horseback riding, wilderness education, and seasonal agricultural activities. The financing had come through by mid-April, a combination of Marcus's own accumulated capital, a business loan from the bank in Millbrook, and a significant investment from Catherine, who'd become increasingly invested in Rebecca's new life and the ranch's potential. The physical work had begun immediately, with contractors arriving to begin renovation projects. Sarah had become fascinated with the transformation. She documented the changes photographically, created drawings of what the completed guest house would look like, and had appointed herself unofficial ambassador for the project to her school classmates. At 8 years old, she understood in some intuitive way that the ranch was becoming something new, and her engagement with that transformation had reflected genuine hope about the future being built. One evening in May, as the first guest accommodations were nearing completion, Marcus had sat with Rebecca on the porch overlooking the property. The renovation work was visible in progress, new structures rising, old buildings being reinforced, the landscape gradually transforming under the direction of Wheeler and his team. "I never imagined this would happen," Marcus had said quietly. "A year ago I was convinced that my isolation was wisdom. I had no idea I was actually just afraid." Rebecca had taken his hand, a gesture that had become natural and unremarkable between them over the preceding months. "Afraid isn't a character flaw. It's just a reasonable human response to having been hurt. But you moved through the fear instead of letting it paralyze you forever." The comment had prompted Marcus to reflect on the actual timeline of his transformation. It had been less than 6 months since Rebecca and Sarah had arrived on his porch in the midst of a blizzard. 6 months to dismantle 17 years of carefully constructed isolation. 6 months to rebuild his capacity for connection, vulnerability, and ambition. 6 months to understand that the life he'd believed was protecting him had actually been slowly destroying him. By June, the first phase of the ranch expansion was essentially complete. The guest accommodations were finished. 4 modest but comfortable cottages arranged around a central gathering space. The infrastructure for welcoming visitors had been established. Educational programming had been developed in collaboration with the Millbrook School District. The first group of visiting school classes was scheduled for late summer. Hendricks had commented on the transformation during a routine property check. "This place is going to be something special. You're building something that actually matters, beyond just your own survival." The distinction had resonated with Marcus. For 17 years, he'd focused exclusively on survival, maintaining his property, keeping his herd healthy, managing his finances, existing without causing significant disruption. He'd called it wisdom, called it self-sufficiency, called it independence. But Rebecca and Sarah's presence had revealed the limitation of that framework. Survival wasn't the same as living. Existence wasn't the same as purpose. The ranch's new direction represented something Marcus had abandoned when Eleanor rejected him: the possibility that his life could matter beyond his immediate personal satisfaction. As summer approached and the reality of transformed circumstances became increasingly apparent, Marcus found himself reflecting on who he'd been 6 months earlier and who he was becoming. The person who'd purchased this ranch specifically for isolation had evolved into someone building a space designed to welcome others, to share knowledge and experience, to create something that extended beyond the boundaries of his own isolated existence. The transformation wasn't complete. There remained aspects of his reserved nature that would always characterize him. There were still moments when he felt the pull of his protective isolation, when the demands of shared life felt overwhelming. But those moments no longer represented temptation. They were simply part of the complicated reality of genuine human connection and sustained commitment to a life beyond himself. By late summer, the Clearwater Ranch had become something that would have been unrecognizable to the Marcus who'd purchased it 17 years earlier. The first group of school visitors had arrived in August, and their presence had transformed the property into something actively alive, with purpose beyond Marcus's solitary operations. 35 students from Millbrook Elementary had spent 3 days learning about sustainable agriculture, participating in cattle work with appropriate supervision, understanding water systems and environmental stewardship, and experiencing rural life in ways that contrasted dramatically with their urban and suburban backgrounds. Sarah had served as unofficial guide for the youngest students, demonstrating with the unself-conscious confidence of childhood exactly how the ranch operated. She'd shown visitors the greenhouse Marcus had repaired with Rebecca's help months earlier, explained the water filtration systems, and had even convinced her school friends to participate in basic livestock care. Her comfort in this space that had once been exclusively Marcus's sanctuary was complete and unremarkable. The ranch had become as much her home as his, perhaps more so given that she'd never known it during its isolated phase. Rebecca had coordinated the educational programming, working with teachers to ensure that the experience aligned with curriculum standards while providing authentic exposure to agricultural practices. Her professional competence had extended into this new realm seamlessly. Watching her move through the ranch while hosting educational groups, Marcus had recognized how thoroughly she'd integrated into every aspect of his existence. She wasn't simply living at the ranch. She was actively shaping what it had become. The evening after the first school group had departed, Marcus had found himself reflecting on a conversation that had occurred months earlier. Vernon Garrett, the man whose militia had attempted to arrest Margaret Hayes in the original story Rebecca and Sarah had reminded him of during one of their evenings together, had ultimately changed his perspective through witnessing his enemies show him mercy. Marcus hadn't experienced anything so dramatic. His transformation had been quieter, more gradual, less theatrical, but it was no less fundamental. A letter had arrived at the ranch in late August that brought the personal nature of his transformation into sharp relief. It was from Eleanor, his ex-fiancée from Denver, the woman whose rejection had motivated 17 years of protective isolation. The letter explained that she'd seen his name mentioned in a regional agricultural magazine feature about innovative agritourism operations in Wyoming. She'd read about the Clearwater Ranch's educational mission and about Marcus's commitment to sustainable practices and community engagement. The letter itself had been carefully written, neither apologetic nor presumptuous. Eleanor had explained that she'd often wondered what had become of him over the years, that she'd felt some guilt about how she'd ended their relationship, and that seeing evidence of his success had given her genuine happiness. She wasn't asking for anything specific. She simply wanted him to know that she'd thought of him, that she recognized what he'd built, and that she hoped he was genuinely happy. Marcus had read the letter multiple times before showing it to Rebecca. Part of him had felt the old wound reactivate, the reminder of Eleanor's rejection and the pain that had driven his isolation strategy. But the wound had felt different now. It was memory rather than active injury. It was history rather than determination for his present existence. Rebecca had read the letter carefully and had offered her perspective with characteristic directness. She's recognizing that you've become someone worth knowing. That's not an insignificant thing, even if it came too late for your relationship. The fact that it doesn't destroy you anymore means you've actually healed. Marcus had understood the accuracy of her observation. The old Marcus would have felt Eleanor's letter as confirmation of his isolation strategy, evidence that distance was wisdom, proof that his protective separation had been necessary. The current Marcus recognized it simply as communication from a person he'd once cared about, someone who'd hurt him, but who'd also been part of his journey in ways neither of them had anticipated. In September, the ranch received visitors who represented a different kind of reckoning. David Hendricks brought his extended family, his wife, adult children and grandchildren, to experience the ranch's hospitality. What had begun as Marcus's relationship with his ranch manager had evolved into something approximating genuine friendship. Hendricks's family spent a weekend learning about the property, participating in cattle operations, and experiencing the authentic hospitality that Rebecca and Marcus had developed. During that visit, Hendricks had pulled Marcus aside and made an observation that had carried unexpected weight. You know what's remarkable about this place now? It's not that it's profitable or innovative. It's that it feels like somewhere people want to be. Your isolated ranch was efficient, but it was lonely. This place is alive. The distinction had resonated because it articulated something Marcus had been gradually understanding but hadn't fully articulated to himself. The transformation of the Clearwater Ranch hadn't been primarily about business success or professional ambition. It had been about creating a space where other people wanted to be, where human connection and shared experience generated their own value, separate from economic calculations. By October, as fall began its gradual transformation of the Wyoming landscape, Marcus had received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Wheeler, the agricultural consultant who'd helped develop the ranch's expansion strategy. Wheeler wanted to discuss a proposal that went beyond the current operations. There's significant interest from investors in expanding this model to other properties, Wheeler had explained. Educational agritourism is becoming increasingly valuable as people seek authentic experiences in natural settings. Your ranch has become a model operation. I'm receiving inquiries about whether you'd be interested in expanding or consulting with other ranchers attempting similar transformations. The proposal had represented an external validation of everything that had shifted since that blizzard night when Rebecca and Sarah had arrived on his porch. The ranch's success wasn't an anomaly. It represented something genuinely valuable, something that could potentially be replicated, something that extended Marcus's impact beyond his individual property and into a broader community of agricultural professionals. Yet Marcus had hesitated before committing to Wheeler's proposal. He'd recognized in that moment that his journey wasn't about maximizing success or expanding influence. It was about creating a life where he genuinely belonged, where other people mattered to him and where he mattered to them, where the fundamental loneliness that had characterized 17 years of isolation had been replaced by authentic connection. "I'm interested in consulting," he'd told Wheeler carefully, "but not in expanding my own operations beyond what we've built here. This ranch is specific. Its value is in its particularity, in the relationships we've built here. I don't want to turn it into a franchise or a replicable model that loses the human element that makes it meaningful." Rebecca had supported this decision completely. She'd understood that Marcus's resistance to aggressive expansion came from hard-earned wisdom about what actually matters, what creates genuine satisfaction versus what simply generates metrics of success. In late October, as the first anniversary of Rebecca and Sarah's arrival approached, Marcus found himself contemplating a question he'd never imagined asking during his 17 years of isolation. He'd consulted with Catherine, with Rebecca's mother, about his intentions. He'd acquired his mother's approval and her involvement in planning. He'd even involved Sarah as an unlikely confidant, asking her opinion about something he was considering. On the anniversary of that night, when Rebecca had pounded on his door with a daughter struggling to breathe, Marcus had organized what appeared to be a simple dinner celebrating their year together. But during dessert, he'd moved to a different question entirely. He'd asked Rebecca to marry him, presenting his grandmother's engagement ring that he'd discovered in his mother's possessions during their reconciliation months earlier. Rebecca's response had been immediate and overwhelming. But the most significant moment had come when she'd asked Sarah for her blessing first, understanding that any commitment between them was fundamentally a commitment to the three of them as a family unit. Sarah's enthusiastic agreement had transformed the moment from romantic gesture into genuine family commitment. The proposal had represented something that Marcus couldn't have imagined during his 17 years of isolated existence. It represented the willingness to commit his entire future to other people, to accept permanent interdependence, to build a life where his own preferences and needs were genuinely secondary to larger family purposes. It represented the distance traveled from the man who'd purchased a ranch specifically to avoid human connection to the man who was now choosing to bind his life permanently to two people he'd met barely a year. Earlier, during a medical emergency, the wedding took place in June, a year and a half after that blizzard night when Rebecca and Sarah had arrived on Marcus's porch. It was held at the ranch itself, the property having become large enough and established enough to accommodate the gathering comfortably. Approximately 150 people attended, family members, friends, professional colleagues, and members of the Millbrook community who'd become connected to the ranch through its educational mission over the preceding months. Marcus's mother was present, having traveled from her home in Denver, where she'd spent the last year rebuilding her relationship with her son. She'd watched the transformation with the particular attention of a parent who'd worried for years and had finally seen evidence that her son was learning to live rather than merely survive. Catherine, Rebecca's mother, served as one of the event coordinators, having become increasingly invested in the ranch and in Marcus's genuine integration into their family structure. Sarah walked Rebecca down the aisle, a deliberate choice that had honored the reality of their family configuration. She'd worn a small bridesmaid's dress and had carried flowers with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of the ceremony. At 9 years old, she'd lived through her own journey of transformation, from a child struggling to breathe in an emergency vehicle to someone who'd made a home in an unexpected place, who'd adopted a reserved rancher as part of her family structure, who'd learned that human kindness could emerge from strangers and could reshape the trajectory of an entire life. During the reception, David Hendricks had given a toast that had captured something essential about what had shifted at the Clearwater Ranch. He'd spoken about witnessing isolation transform into community, about watching a man who seemed content with solitude discover that contentment wasn't the same as happiness. He'd noted that the most profound changes often came not from dramatic decisions, but from the simple choice to say yes when someone in crisis arrived at your door. The marriage itself had become a symbol of something larger than just two people committing to shared life. It represented the possibility that deeply held protective patterns could be examined and reconsidered. It demonstrated that the life someone believed was protecting them might actually be slowly killing them. It showed that transformation was possible at any age, in any circumstance. If someone was willing to risk the vulnerability that genuine connection required, but the most significant recognition came from an unexpected quarter. In September of that year, the Wyoming State Agricultural Department had contacted Marcus with an unusual request. They were developing a statewide initiative to support agricultural education and sustainable farming practices. They'd learned about the Clearwater Ranch's educational mission and the innovative approaches Marcus and Rebecca had developed. They wanted to feature the ranch in a state-level program to present the operation as a model of how private agricultural properties could serve broader educational and community functions. The recognition had coincided with an article in a major national agricultural magazine that had profiled the Clearwater Ranch. Specifically, in Marcus's journey toward building community-engaged agriculture, the article had focused on his transformation from isolation to connection, on how crisis had become catalyst, on how the simple act of helping someone in need had evolved into a comprehensive life restructuring. The profile had caught the attention of agricultural organizations beyond Wyoming. Universities began reaching out, asking if Marcus would be willing to serve on advisory boards for sustainable agriculture programs. Foundations interested in rural education requested proposals for expanded programming at the ranch. The model that Marcus had deliberately chosen not to franchise or expand was becoming recognized as significant simply by virtue of its authenticity. But perhaps most importantly, the recognition had prompted a different kind of reflection within Marcus himself. He'd realized that his resistance to expansion wasn't actually about protecting the ranch's particularity. It was about having learned through his journey with Rebecca and Sarah that the measure of a life well lived wasn't the scale of impact but the depth of connection, the quality of relationships, the authenticity of community created. By the fall of that year, Rebecca was pregnant with their biological child, a development that had delighted Sarah and had solidified their status as a genuine family rather than a blended arrangement. The pregnancy had prompted conversations about the future, about what they were building, not just for themselves, but for the next generation. Marcus had found himself thinking in terms of legacy, not legacy measured in business success or professional recognition, but legacy measured in values transmitted, in patterns interrupted, in the possibility that the children who visited their ranch would carry forward an understanding that human connection mattered, that isolation was a choice rather than a necessity. That transformation was possible for anyone willing to examine their protective patterns. One evening in November, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Marcus and Rebecca had sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the landscape transform under the accumulating white. Sarah was inside doing homework. The cattle were sheltered in the barns. The property seemed to hold its breath as winter approached. "Do you ever miss it?" Rebecca had asked quietly. The isolation, the simplicity of a life where you only had to manage your own survival. Marcus had considered the question seriously. He'd thought about the clarity that isolation had offered, the absence of complicated negotiations, the comfort of structures entirely within his control. But he'd recognized that he was romanticizing what had actually been a form of slow self-destruction disguised as wisdom. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he'd admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness. I didn't understand while I was doing it, but I was slowly dying in that isolation. I was calling it protection when it was actually abandonment. The difference between loneliness and solitude is profound, and I was definitely experiencing loneliness. Even if I'd convinced myself I was choosing healthy solitude." Rebecca had taken his hand, a gesture that had become so natural between them that it required no thought. "You've built something here that proves that people like you, reserved, thoughtful, protective, can still create meaningful connection without losing themselves. That's not a small thing." The conversation had led Marcus to a broader realization about the meaning of his transformation. He'd spent 17 years believing that his nature was incompatible with genuine human connection. He'd accepted the conclusion that his introversion, his preference for structure and solitude, his difficulty with emotional expression meant he was fundamentally unsuited for partnership and family. But his journey with Rebecca and Sarah had revealed the false assumption underlying that belief. His nature hadn't changed. He remained reserved, preferred quiet to noise, still valued solitude and structure. But his capacity for intimate connection, for vulnerability, for commitment to other people, had been revealed as separate from his temperament. He could be his authentic, reserved self and still participate genuinely in meaningful relationships. The distinction mattered enormously, not just for Marcus personally, but potentially for anyone who'd adopted similar protective strategies based on the assumption that their personality type precluded genuine connection. Marcus had become living proof that introversion wasn't isolation. That preference for solitude wasn't incompatibility with intimacy. That reserved nature didn't require a life lived alone. By the end of that year, the Clearwater Ranch had completed its transformation from a property maintained by one isolated man into a thriving community space that honored both individual needs and collective connection. The guest cottages were regularly occupied by visiting educators, agricultural professionals, family groups seeking authentic rural experience. The educational programs served hundreds of students annually. The property operated with genuine profitability while maintaining its primary purpose of creating spaces where people could experience something beyond their ordinary existence. But perhaps more importantly, the ranch had become a home where 3 people, soon to be 4, had learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that asking for help wasn't failure, that choosing connection over protection was the most courageous decision a person could make. The story of how a lonely giant rancher had responded to a child's plea for help had evolved into something far more significant than a single act of compassion. It had become evidence that people could fundamentally transform their entire existence by choosing vulnerability over protection, by allowing crisis to become catalyst, by recognizing that the life they'd believed was protecting them was actually preventing them from becoming fully alive. In the spring following Marcus and Rebecca's wedding, the Clearwater Ranch hosted a visitor who would inadvertently crystallize the full significance of what Marcus's transformation had created. Dr. James Patterson was a clinical psychologist from Boulder, Colorado, who'd read the agricultural magazine profile about Marcus's journey and had reached out with a proposal that initially seemed unusual for a rancher. Managing educational agritourism operations, Patterson specialized in research about isolation, emotional resilience, and the psychological effects of deliberate social withdrawal. He'd spent 2 decades studying the distinction between healthy solitude and pathological isolation, examining how protective strategies that initially served survival functions could calcify into self-destructive patterns. He'd read about Marcus's story and had recognized in it something significant, a real-world documentation of how someone could recognize and interrupt an entrenched isolation pattern, not through therapy or intervention, but through forced crisis that demanded vulnerability. Patterson had asked if he could spend a week at the ranch observing operations, interviewing Marcus and Rebecca about their experiences, and potentially developing a case study that could be valuable for both psychological research and broader public understanding of how people often self-select into isolation based on false assumptions about what protects them. Marcus had been hesitant initially. The idea of his personal transformation being analyzed and documented had felt uncomfortably exposing. But Rebecca had encouraged him to consider the potential value. If Marcus's story could help other people recognize similar patterns in their own lives, the discomfort of vulnerability seemed justified. Patterson arrived in May and had spent his week at the ranch conducting what amounted to extended interviews with both Marcus and Rebecca. He'd observed how they interacted with each other, how they managed household decisions, how they engaged with the visiting school groups and educational programs. He'd reviewed financial records and business documentation related to the ranch's transformation. He'd spent significant time with Sarah, understanding how her presence had functioned as a catalyst, an ongoing reminder of why the commitment to connection mattered. On his final evening at the ranch, Patterson had shared preliminary observations that had captured something essential about Marcus's journey. He'd noted that Marcus's isolation hadn't been the result of introversion or natural preference for solitude. It had been a protective strategy that he'd adopted in response to specific trauma. Eleanor's rejection that had then become so thoroughly embedded in his identity that he'd constructed an entire philosophical justification for it. What strikes me most significantly is that you didn't recognize it was a pattern until it was interrupted, Patterson had explained. Most people who adopt protective isolation continue indefinitely because the protection works. It prevents them from experiencing the trigger that activated it in the first place. But you had the unexpected fortune of being forced into vulnerability by someone in genuine crisis. And instead of retreating further, you chose to allow that vulnerability to reveal something about yourself that your protective strategy had concealed. Patterson had also noted something about the significance of Rebecca and Sarah's particular roles in Marcus's transformation. It hadn't been romance or attraction that had prompted change. It had been the specific circumstance of a child in medical distress, combined with a mother's desperate need for help. That combination had short-circuited Marcus's ability to maintain his protective distance because it had accessed something older than his learned isolation strategy, his fundamental human capacity for compassion. You responded not from your adult identity as an isolated rancher, but from your earlier identity as someone who naturally helped others, Patterson had observed. Your 7-year-old self, Your 15-year-old self, your 25-year-old self before Eleanor, all of those versions of you were still present beneath the constructed isolation. The crisis accessed those earlier identities and made them available again. The conversation had prompted Marcus to reflect on aspects of his transformation he hadn't fully articulated before. He'd recognized that returning to connection hadn't actually required him to become a different person. It had required him to stop pretending to be someone he'd never actually been, someone fundamentally isolated by nature rather than by circumstance and choice. Patterson had spent his final days at the ranch, interviewing visitors to the educational programs, school teachers, visiting ranchers interested in agritourism, families seeking authentic rural experience. He'd asked them what they perceived the ranch's significance to be. Almost universally, they described it as a place that felt genuinely alive, where educational content was paired with authentic human connection, where they felt welcomed and valued rather than processed through a transaction. One visiting teacher had articulated something that Patterson had noted as particularly significant. "This place feels like someone genuinely cares whether we're here. It's not just a transaction. It's an actual invitation into someone's world." Before departing, Patterson had asked Marcus a final question that had carried unexpected weight. If you could go back and counsel your 35-year-old self, the man who purchased this ranch specifically for isolation, what would you tell him? Marcus had considered the question seriously. He'd thought about the person he'd been, the pain that had driven him, the logic that had seemed so sound at the time. After a long pause, he'd responded, "I would tell him that pain is temporary, but isolation makes pain permanent. That protection only works until it stops, until life presents something you can't ignore or escape from. And I would tell him that he's so much more capable of connection and resilience than he believes, that the vulnerability he's terrified of isn't actually weakness. It's the only thing that makes life worth living." Patterson had left the ranch with significant material for research and reflection. He'd promised to share his findings with Marcus and Rebecca once his analysis was complete. But more importantly, his visit had served to externally validate what Marcus had been learning internally, that his transformation was significant, not just personally but potentially universally, relevant for anyone who'd adopted protective isolation based on false assumptions about their own capabilities or limitations. Over the summer, more visitors arrived with similar purposes. A documentary filmmaker wanted to produce a short film about the ranch's educational mission. An author researching narratives of personal transformation wanted to conduct interviews. A non-profit organization focused on rural mental health wanted to understand how the ranch had become a space where isolated rural people felt welcomed and connected. Each of these external recognitions had been validating. But Marcus had learned something crucial through the process. The actual significance of his transformation wasn't measured by outside recognition or professional documentation. It was measured by the ordinary daily reality of waking up each morning in a home filled with people who mattered to him, of doing work that served purposes beyond his own survival, of having genuine relationships built on authentic vulnerability rather than protective distance. By the end of summer, Rebecca gave birth to their daughter, Julia, completing their family expansion in ways both practical and symbolic. Marcus found himself in the unexpected position of being a father to a biological child, a responsibility he'd never imagined accepting, given his deliberate decades-long choice of isolation. But he'd discovered through his time with Sarah that his capacity for parental care and commitment had never actually disappeared. It had simply been dormant, waiting for circumstances that demanded he access it. Holding his newborn daughter while Rebecca rested, Marcus had found himself reflecting on the extraordinary distance he'd traveled. 2 years earlier, he'd been convinced that isolation was wisdom, that his solitude was protection, that his life was exactly as he'd chosen to construct it. Now he was a married man with 2 children, actively engaged in community education, recognized for his contributions to sustainable agriculture, and fundamentally transformed in ways that would have been incomprehensible to his 35-year-old self. The transformation hadn't made him someone he wasn't. It had simply allowed him to become fully himself, to integrate the compassionate, service-oriented aspects of his nature with his genuine preference for quiet and reflection. He'd learned that he could be reserved without being isolated, thoughtful without being withdrawn, introspective without being disconnected from human community. That learning, far more than any external recognition or professional documentation, represented the true significance of what had begun that night when a woman and child had arrived at his door, desperate for help. 3 years after that blizzard night, Marcus stood in the greenhouse he'd repaired with Rebecca's help, watching Sarah and their daughter Julia work together on propagating seedlings for the spring planting season. Julia was still too young to be genuinely useful. Her participation consisted primarily of making muddy fingerprints on the work surfaces and asking endless questions about why seeds needed soil and water. But Sarah, now 12 years old, moved with the competence of someone who'd genuinely become part of the ranch's operations, understanding soil composition and plant physiology with the kind of knowledge that came from genuine interest rather than forced education. This ordinary moment, 3 people working together in a greenhouse on a March afternoon, represented something that Marcus could never have imagined during his 17 years of isolation. It represented the possibility of an entirely different kind of life than the one he'd constructed, a life where the measures of success were fundamentally different from what he'd used during his decades of deliberate solitude. For those 17 years, Marcus had measured his life in terms of efficiency, control, and absence of complications. He'd tracked his success by cattle herd numbers, financial profit margins, the absence of unexpected demands on his time and attention, and the consistent predictability of his daily routines. These measures had provided a certain kind of satisfaction. He'd known exactly where he stood at any moment. He'd maintained a clear sense of competence and mastery over his domain, but those measures had been profoundly incomplete. They'd reflected only the portions of his existence that could be quantified and controlled. They'd ignored the dimensions of life that couldn't be measured in financial terms or efficiency metrics, the quality of relationships, the depth of connection, the sense of genuine belonging, the experience of mattering to people beyond transactional exchange. The shift in how Marcus measured his life had been gradual rather than sudden. It hadn't come from any single moment of clarity or revelation. Instead, it had emerged through the accumulation of ordinary interactions. Sarah asking him questions about how systems worked, Rebecca laughing at something he'd said, Julia reaching for his hand, watching visitors arrive at the ranch and experience something that genuinely moved them. Each moment had been small individually, but collectively, they'd built an understanding that the most important dimensions of life were precisely those that defied measurement. This realization had profound implications that Marcus was still processing. It meant that all the protection his isolation had offered was protection from the wrong things. It meant that the vulnerabilities he'd been so desperately trying to avoid, rejection, disappointment, the possibility of being hurt, were actually inseparable from anything worth experiencing. It meant that the safety he'd created had been purchased at the cost of genuinely living. One evening, Marcus had been reviewing old journal entries from his early years of isolation, notebooks where he'd documented his philosophy and justified his choices. Reading those entries had been strange, like encountering a different person entirely. The arguments that had seemed so compelling 17 years earlier now felt like the reasoning of someone who'd been deeply afraid, but who'd mistaken fear for wisdom. He'd written things like, "True strength is self-sufficiency. Depending on others creates weakness and vulnerability," and "The most rational approach to potential, betrayal, is to eliminate the possibility of connection." through which betrayal could occur. And my isolation is evidence of wisdom, not damage. But living with Rebecca and Sarah had revealed the logical flaws in those arguments. True strength wasn't the ability to survive alone. It was the courage to be vulnerable with other people. Real wisdom wasn't the elimination of risk. It was the recognition that meaningful life required accepting certain risks as necessary costs of genuine engagement. As Marcus had reflected on those old journal entries, he'd understood something about what his isolation had actually been. It had been intellectual justification for emotional self-protection. He'd clothed fear in the language of philosophy and called it wisdom. He'd disguised despair as contentment. He'd presented profound damage as deliberate choice. The recognition wasn't judgmental. It was simply honest acknowledgement of how trauma responses work. When someone experiences profound rejection or betrayal, their psyche generates protective mechanisms designed to prevent repetition of the injury. Those mechanisms often feel like wisdom in the moment. They often feel like the only reasonable response to having learned that other people can't be trusted. But those mechanisms stop being protective and become destructive when they continue indefinitely. When someone mistakes the absence of pain for the presence of health. When they construct an entire philosophy around something that originated in fear. That was what had happened to Marcus. Eleanor's rejection had been the initial injury. His isolation had been the protective mechanism. But 17 years later, that mechanism was no longer protective. It had transformed into something that was slowly killing him while he'd convinced himself he was protecting himself. The blizzard that brought Rebecca and Sarah to his door had disrupted his carefully maintained protective strategy. But the disruption hadn't been accidental. It had been exactly what he'd needed. A circumstance so compelling that his habitual protective responses couldn't maintain their normal operation. It had forced him out of his defensive posture just long enough to remember what he'd been defending himself against, recognizing that he was capable of genuine connection, and that connection was worth the vulnerability it required. Now, standing in the greenhouse watching Sarah and Julia work with the seedlings, Marcus found himself contemplating what he would tell his 35-year-old self, the man who'd purchased this ranch specifically to avoid the kind of connection that was now the most valuable part of his existence. He would tell that younger version of himself that pain was temporary, but that isolation made it permanent. He would tell him that the vulnerability he was terrified of wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made life genuinely worth living. He would tell him that the strength he was celebrating wasn't strength at all. It was just very sophisticated avoidance. He would tell him that one day, not soon, but eventually, someone in genuine crisis would arrive at his door, and that the choice he made in that moment would reshape his entire understanding of what was possible for his life. That the compassion he'd suppressed wouldn't be extinguished by 17 years of deliberate isolation. That it would emerge instantly when confronted with genuine need. That his capacity for connection hadn't been destroyed, it had only been waiting. Most importantly, he would tell his younger self that the life he was building through isolation wasn't actually a life. It was just a very organized way of slowly dying while mistaking the absence of complications for the presence of wisdom. But since Marcus couldn't actually communicate with his younger self, he was beginning to understand that the purpose of his transformation was different. The significance of his journey wasn't measured in what it meant for him personally, though the personal transformation was profound. The significance was that his journey demonstrated something crucial for anyone else who'd adopted similar protective strategies. That transformation was possible at any age, in any circumstance. If someone was willing to disrupt their established patterns and risk the vulnerability that genuine connection required. There were thousands of people living in versions of Marcus's 17-year isolation. They might not be literally alone on isolated ranches. They might be surrounded by other people, but emotionally disconnected. They might be protecting themselves through various mechanisms, Perfectionism, workaholism, intellectual superiority, emotional unavailability, cynicism about human connection. The specific protective strategy varied, but the underlying pattern was consistent. They'd experienced enough pain or rejection that they'd constructed barriers specifically designed to prevent repetition. And those barriers worked in a sense. They did prevent the specific pain they were designed to protect against. But they prevented everything else as well: genuine connection, authentic belonging, the experience of mattering to someone beyond transactional exchange, the profound satisfaction of being known by another person and choosing them anyway. Marcus understood now that his 18-year transformation, 17 years of isolation plus the year and a half of genuine change, told a story that needed to be known. Not because his story was unique or exceptional. It was instructive precisely because it was ordinary. It was the story of a person with understandable reasons for his protective strategy, discovering that the protection was too expensive, that the cost of safety was the elimination of life itself. As dusk fell over the ranch and Marcus guided Sarah and Julia back toward the house, he reflected on what his life had become. Not perfect, he and Rebecca still navigated the complications of genuine partnership, managing different communication styles and occasionally conflicting needs. Not without challenges. Parenting two children with different developmental stages and different needs required constant adjustment and compromise. Not without the persistence of his reserved temperament. He still valued quiet and solitude, still required time alone to process emotions, still struggled occasionally with emotional expression, but his life was genuine in ways that his 17 years of isolation had never been. It was rooted in actual connection rather than isolated safety. It was directed toward purposes that extended beyond his individual survival. It was marked by real relationships with people who mattered to him and to whom he mattered. The question that had driven Marcus for 17 years, how could he protect himself from pain and disappointment, had been revealed as the wrong question entirely. The right question was different. How could he live in a way that made genuine connection possible despite the vulnerability it required? That question had redirected his entire existence. It had transformed him from someone who measured life by what he could control into someone who understood that the most meaningful dimensions of existence were precisely those beyond his control. It had turned him from a man planning isolation into someone building community. It had taken someone who'd convinced himself that connection was impossible and revealed that it had only been feared. 3 years after that blizzard, Marcus understood what the most important lesson of his transformation had been. The difference between surviving and living isn't about external circumstances. It's about whether you've allowed yourself to genuinely matter to other people and to allow others to matter to you. Everything else, success, comfort, security, efficiency, is secondary to that fundamental human need to be known and chosen anyway. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.